go home, but it's too much of a hassle.
Yeah, it is.
I know. I just want to sleep. 12 hours each day.
Get out of sleep much time.
I think that maybe on average 5 to 6, but I work 12.
Yikes.
And, yeah. I prefer sleeping alone, but I haven't been lately, so that makes things even worse. Just because I don't sleep well with the body in my bed. That's the problem. I can imagine. I'm so jealous of people who get 30.
But you just have to make it.
Make it.
I mean, even
It helps to be disciplined.
even when I was in undergrad, I mean, I think probably 2, maybe 3 times I told about it. All my years studying, it was so counterproductive. You know, after about 10 o'clock, I'm just kind of,
Yeah, you don't
not
do
doing it.
anything.
Exactly. So I always go to bed. Sometimes I feel.
Well, I didn't have a chance to compare notes with John and Yvette. So the first thing is, does anybody have any questions about their contribution to the course? John came to work with me in Chicago, I think around 1969 as a postdoc. And that year, it was still the time of affluence in ecology. We could afford to rent a shrimp trawler and have an expedition in the Caribbean. The expedition was island biogeography. And so we went from island to island east of Puerto Rico. The usual routine is to first sail around the island once and see what you can deduce from offshore, from looking at the vegetation. For instance, it's pretty obvious if an island is infested with rats or with goats. Then we would land on the island and scatter. People would spend the afternoon working independently, looking around to see what sort of problems they might be interested in. In preparing a field trip, it's good to have in mind some of the problems you'd like to work on, but also be open to change your mind completely. And for John, the important thing was ants. I had introduced him to ants in the classroom. And there are a number of reasons for being interested in the ants. One is that they're social insects, and so you can use the study of ants to look at some of the questions of social organization. The other is that ant ecology takes place at a number of different levels. And when we get into complexity, I hope to come back to this. But basically the idea is that a colony of ants consists of individuals that are, for the most part, genetically the same. Some species have multiple queens, so there'll be genetic variation. They communicate by odor trails. What happens is that in the course of the day, the ants come out of the nest to look for food. Now the urgency to look for food, the pressure to look for food, depends on the young that have to be fed. Because the mature ants you need energy, but it's the young that need protein. So depending upon how big is the brood inside the nest, you'll get a greater or lesser push to go out foraging. What brings them back into the nest is either that they find food or else it's getting too hot for them. There's desiccation stress. So for instance, in the deserts of Arizona, these species I was studying would be active when the temperature got above about 16 degrees Celsius. Before that, you see them milling about at the entrance to the nest. At 16 degrees, they head out along trails that they'd already established, looking for seed to gather. And they work there until about 9 or so in the morning when it starts getting too hot. It had already gotten too hot for their competitors. So between about 9 and 10, they dominate the field without competition, bringing seeds back to the nest. When they feel the stress of heat, they can do two things. One of them is to go up a blade of grass to cool off, and the other is to get on their hind legs and raise their head up. Now the difference between ground temperature and the temperature of an ant's head is quite big. It can be as much as 5 degrees. The gradients in the environment are quite extreme for small things, over small distances. Well, all of this then is a dynamics in which the ants are pushed out of the nest because of food to be gathered, and go back to the nest because it's getting uncomfortable out there, or because they found what they're looking for. For some ants, what they're looking for is quite dramatic. For instance, the leaf-cutting ants, from their name you can see, cut the leaves off plants and carry them back to the nest. In the nest, there are other ants that chew up the leaves, making a kind of mash. A third group of ants inoculate it with the spores of a fungus. The fungus grows, and that's the food for the ants and for the young. When the ants are bringing leaves to the nest, it's really rather dramatic. You see rows of leaves marching across the floor of the forest. So all of this is happening on a time scale of minutes to hours. Over this time scale, the total number of ants in the colony doesn't change much. It depends on the size of the brood, number of offspring. So they're going in and out. So if you're attempting to model the number of ants that you can observe, what you would do is treat the number in the nest as constant, and the variables would be the number that are outside and inside. And the number inside is just the total minus the number outside. So there's basically one variable, the number of ants moving about. And the parameters of the situation are the pressures to move out looking for food and the forces sending them back into the nest, either because they found it or because it's getting uncomfortable. But the colony size on the time scale that we're looking is fixed. Now obviously we know that's not true. What determines the colony size? And that determines the balance between the number of offspring being produced and the death rate. The number of offspring being produced depends on the food that's being brought in and the number of queens laying eggs. Mortality for ants involves predation. Sometimes I've watched lizards perched at the edges of ant trails, ready to pounce. So there's a loss due to mortality. There are other predators, spiders. For some species, the problem is other ants. So as a result of this, the number of ants in the colony, which determines the daily flux, is something which is fixed over a time scale of weeks, the time that it takes for the brood to mature, and the constants are the populations of predators for the most part. So then you have to ask, and competitors, other ants. So then you ask, but what determines the number of predators and the number of competing ants? And that depends on the amount of food available for them. So if they're ant hunters, the amount of food available for them is the number of ants. Or it may be that they live on other foods mostly, and ants are only part of the diet. Like for most lizards, they have a broad diet of different kinds of insects. So then the question of the size of the colony, something varying on a time frame of weeks, will determine the density of colonies of competitors and the number of predators.
I have a question. Is there a minimum size of the colony? And what supported the decision to move from one colony and to evolve? For example, what is the maximum size that
Yes.
they will open another brood and like create a structure?
All right, this varies very much with the kind of ant. When the queens reproduce, they go out in a flight and they're fertilized in flight, land on the ground, and during that first period, they have to dig a hole for themselves and lay a few eggs. At that time, they can't gather any food. They have to do it for themselves because there are no workers. So one thing that determines the number of new colonies is the survival of the fertilized queens. After a period of days to weeks, the first workers come out. They tend to be smaller than the workers of the final colony, but they're the ones who start gathering the food and feeding the queen, and the queen stays in the nest from there on without doing any food gathering. The predators of queens are very active at that time. When the ants are swarming, their predators come out in droves. Some of them will be other ants that feed on the queens. Some would be lizards, in some places snakes. There'll be some predatory insects, scorpions, spiders. So these will be the influences on the growing size of the colony. When a colony is prospering, then it can found new colonies. And this is done in two ways. For some ants, the colony simply spreads. And so an area will, even though you see a lot of holes in the surface, it could be all one colony connected by tunnels. These will be colonies with multiple queens. They don't do very much flying. They spread on the surface. Now, when you observe these in nature, what you find is that they do not occupy a lot of the islands, because getting from one island to another is difficult, and they don't fly, or hardly fly. On the other hand, they're very abundant where they are, because the colonies spread out and are numerous, and it could be whole hectares or square kilometers that you could treat as a single colony. The other kind of reproduction is that they begin to produce queens. When nutrition is good, the workers bring in special food. Some of the pupae are given special food. They become queens. And then the queens fly out with the males. The males are winged also, and they're smaller. During most of the year, males are produced and don't really do much of anything. So the term drone, referring to the male ant, is also used as a term to indicate not good for very much. In that flight, the female mates only once. The rest of the males go to the ground and drop their wings and are preyed on. The queen is fertilized and lands, sheds her wings, does no more flying, and gets to the business of building a new colony in a hurry. So then the question becomes, how far can they fly? And once again, this depends on the kind of ant. And I remember that on our shrimp trawler out at sea, we found a queen of a fire ant resting on the mast. She was treating the boat as an island. Some islands are useful to ants as resting places. They'll stay there for a few hours, they'll feed and move on, but could not reproduce. And so one of the things that was called to our attention is that not every island is an island. It depends on the species. In the Caribbean, there are islands which are simply sandbars. And so for ants that live in the mangroves, they simply don't exist as islands, not for reproduction. There are other islands that are just mangrove swamps, no sand. So it's the ants that can live up in the twigs that consider these islands and use them to go island hopping. but the sandbars don't exist. There are some that can use both. For them, there are a lot more islands. They can do more island hopping, and so they're more abundant in the sense of occupying a greater proportion of the total islands present. Not only of total islands because there are more kinds, but even of the islands of their preferred type. Because if there are islands that they can rest on and move on, then the average distance between islands is less, and that makes the migration easier. So at one level, we're looking at the size of colonies. At the next level, the number of colonies on an island, which depends on their successful reproduction, feeding, as against predation. Then beyond that, there's the number of islands that are occupied by the ants. Now, from the point of view of modeling, at each level you're working on a different time scale, and different aspects of their biology are treated as constant or variable. At one level, the number of colonies is treated as constant. At another, that's one of the variables that's being determined by the balance of colony formation versus predation. You asked, what might lead them to abandon colonies? We've had two kinds of experience in this. First of all, there are two species of ants, fire ants and lion ants, which are similar enough to be competitors. The fire ant is native to the Americas, and so presumably it's been there for thousands of years. The lion ant is of African origin, and we believe it came over with the slave trade. Both of them form very large colonies. Their favorite food is plant seeds. They're polymorphic. The lion ant has worker ants of different sizes. There are small workers, and there are large-headed ants that we call soldiers, but actually are used for cracking seeds. They also defend the colony. And by the way, all of these are female. All worker ants are female. When students go into the field, they very often start referring to the soldiers as male and the workers as female because of the prejudices that we bring from our species. Fire ants are also polymorphic, but for them, the ants cover a very wide range of sizes. It's not two discrete sizes. And there's a division of labor among them. It's the fire ant that has a sting. In the wild, before the ants became socialized, that sting was an ovipositor for laying eggs. In the evolution of the social insects, the workers stopped laying eggs, and that same structure became a sting, which is stocked with formic acid. And it's the formic acid that produces the painful sting of the fire ant. Well, these two species live in the Caribbean. They go through the cycles of colonizing new places and becoming extinct when an island becomes uninhabitable or because of competition or other things. If queens come to an island occupied by the other species, if it's a big enough island, they may find a place to found a colony. If it's a small island, then they'll probably be eaten before they have a chance to do anything. Our work was mostly with small islands, and so we would look at the colonization of islands, and we realized that the species which gets there first has an advantage. That's more important than the secondary biological differences, where fire ants don't do much climbing, but lion ants climb bushes and trees. On the other hand, they're less tolerant of heat. So it's a balance of vegetation and exposed areas and temperature, which gives some advantage. But the big advantage is getting there first. The large colony has an advantage over small colonies. So we were wondering how this happened. And what we did was decide to introduce ants lion ants onto an island inhabited by fire ants. These are small islands, so that it's not possible for them to both control territories. We introduced the lion ant rather than the fire ant because the fire ants live in very deep nests, whereas the lion ant can also colonize coconuts on the ground. And so what we would do is fill up a sack of inhabited coconuts, where each coconut would have a colony of several hundred lion ants. And we'd put them at various places on the island and watch them. After a few hours, some of the ants are coming out cautiously, laying trails, looking for food along these trails. Now this is an island which has fire ants, and so in the course of their wanderings, they're going to meet other ants, fire ants or other lion ants. If they meet other lion ants, well, it's their own kind, it doesn't cause any problem. If they meet fire ants, the usual thing that happens is that both of them pull away. Ants are not very warlike. They'll pull back, and then they won't leave a signal, here be food. So it starts restricting where they can look for food. Now, since the island is dominated by fire ants, most of the encounters of fire ants is with other fire ants. But most of the encounters of lion ants is with fire ants. So in this early phase, the hunting is disrupted much more for the lion ant than for the fire ant. So they'll go out hunting and then go home. When they have unpleasant encounters, the major reaction is to retreat. Well, we watched them for about a week. And finally the ants decided, to hell with it, this is not a good place to be. And they started a march. And you have this long column of worker ants. Then in the middle there was a section of queen ants and some males and some more worker ants. They were marching out looking for another place to colonize.
This is the lion ant?
Yes. Now, what we knew but they didn't know is any place they chose is also within the range of fire ants. And so we figured they were not going to be very successful. And when we came back a couple of weeks later, they were gone. So this is one way in which colonization operates. Another kind is with natural conditions. On the deserts of Arizona, there are the seed-gathering ants, Pogonomyrmex. And they're very good at gathering seeds. They build a nest with pruning the vegetation. So there's an area clear of vegetation about 2 meters across. And you can even spot these from the air, where the ground looks speckled. They prune the vegetation away from this disc. So what do nasty graduate students do? In the middle of the night, we sneaked out there and planted lettuce on the disc. When the ants came out in the morning, they discovered the lettuce, and before going about their seed gathering business, they cleared away the lettuce and created a garbage heap right beyond the boundary of the nest. Now, it's important that this is a desert for several reasons. One is that evaporation keeps it cool for their competitors. Another is that the seed that they gather might germinate, and then they can't store it. So it's important for them that it be dry. So what do Harvard graduate students do? They set up sprinklers. And we had a sprinkler going for about 3 days over this disc area. And the ants decided this is not where we want to be. And at the end of 3 days, we saw the march. The column of several thousand ants, this was a big colony, heading out looking for another place to nest. So the physical climate can determine where they nest, and also the relations with competitors. So the important thing here is that you have a dynamics occurring at a number of different levels, from minute to minute, and week to week, and month to month. And then in the very longest range, climate change will make some places drier there's been a general drying trend in the Eastern Caribbean for hundreds of years. Lobos Island is one of these islands. And at one point, the government of Puerto Rico decided this would be a glorious place for tourism. So they were going to bring tourists out, and in order to do this, they bulldozed an airstrip down the middle of the island. One side of the airstrip was piles of debris. The other was left as scrubland. In the scrubland, there were lion ants. In the debris side of the island, there was nothing. But, well, I say nothing, it means there weren't any fire ants. Fire ants started flying over from the next island. And they were able to colonize because there were no lion ants around the side of the airstrip. Now, there were other kinds of ants around, too. There's a tiny little short ant that has good tolerance of heat. And in this intermediate strip, it was dominated by the short ant. When we put out food, which was tablespoons of tuna fish, the ants would come out. They'd form a ring around the food. The food was canned tuna fish. And what they would do mostly is slurp up the oil. And you can see their abdomens expand. Because the abdomen of an ant consists of several segments that are overlapping. And when they're filled up with oil, the segments are pushed apart, and you see white stripes going across the ant. So it's very easy to read quickly what's going on. The lion ants were beginning to invade this territory. And if it was a nice, hot, sunny day, and the bait was surrounded by short ants, the lion ants would try to get in and leave. Because the short ant had its backs facing out, sort of like circling the wagons, and it could squirt the lion ant with formic acid and the ants would leave. Unfortunately, they had only a single shot each, and then they'd have to go home to recharge. So there'd be little gaps in the ring of ants around the bait. And that's where if the weather was cool enough, the lion ant would come in. If it was still very hot in the sun, then more short ants would come. If there was shade, the lion ant could squeeze in between the short ants and gradually displace them. There were two sources of shade on the island. Clouds. This is an area that's partly cloudy a lot. And so you'd get clouds, and the clouds would move slowly depending on wind velocity. So this might mean that the place is shaded only for about 15 minutes. That's enough opportunity for the lion ants to get there, but not do very much. Then the area becomes sunny again, they get overheated and leave, and the short ant moves back in. Now, if you had weather where a place was cloudy for hours, then the lion ant can get in and displace the short ant. So we started experimenting with Harvard graduate students, and we would place them as shade screens on one side or another of the nest. And the arrangement was that they would be shade screens for 15 minutes or for half an hour. Longer than half an hour, you have to have a turnover of graduate students, because these are rather hot places. So it turns out that the suitability of this climate for short ants as against lion ants depends on the rate of turnover of clouds, of shade. See, when you talk about the environment, it's not enough to talk about the Earth getting hotter. You'd have to ask the question, what does it do to cloudiness? What happens to wind velocity that causes the clouds to turn over faster? So we've seen interactions of this kind, and I'll go on to dealing with other interactions among ants. John